The sheer brutality of these murders earmark them as something different.
We couldn't believe that the injuries could have been done by somebody of sane mind.
They weren't satisfied with killing them. They had to torture them.
Somewhere in this country at the moment there is a serial murder being reenacted.
In 1888, a series of brutal killings shocked the nation. The perpetrator has become a monster who haunts our nightmares. History's most famous murderer.
Jack the Ripper is the ultimate serial killer for all time and will always be.
In her room, he's got all the time to do what he likes, and he takes her apart.
It was a serial which didn't have a conclusion. It becomes the archetype, the rule setter for all future serial killers.
Welcome to London Walk's Jack the Ripper Walk. My name is Donald, I'm your guide for this evening's walk.
London today, and the continuing popularity of the Whitechapel murders means a huge turnout on the Jack the Ripper tours. Walks that daily snake through the streets of the East End of London.
The name Jack the Ripper is not used until after the fourth killing. Until that time, he is always the East End murderer or the Whitechapel murderer. Whitechapel being one of the districts of the East End and where the first of those murders took place.
The Whitechapel we see today is very different from that of 1888. Then it was a crowded, noisy place by day and by night.
The trades of carpenter, butcher, and shoemaker were very common in the East End. They had sweatshops producing both cheap shoes and cheap clothes, which could be sold in the street markets.
There was this residuum, this pool of casual labour that lived in Whitechapel. It's the bottom of the pile in all sorts of different ways.
There were so many prostitutes on the streets, about 1,200 in that area of London. They were poverty-stricken. Most of them had broken marriages behind them. In most cases, they were drunkards. They would do anything to get the money for a bed for the night, usually by selling sexual favours.
You've lost it. The looks have gone. You haven't got any money. You don't look very respectable. And you end up on the streets of Whitechapel. That's the pits.
Then, suddenly, in the spring of 1888, someone began murdering these women.
The Jack the Ripper story really starts in April 1888, when a prostitute, Emma Smith, was murdered. And that was just regarded as, in fact, what it was, a street robbery and of minor importance. Later that year, 7th of August 1888, there was another murder.
The first Ripper murder to make the papers was the murder of Martha Tabram. Now, this was simply a prostitute found with many stab wounds on a staircase.
She was stabbed 39 times, her throat wasn't cut, and again it was regarded as an isolated murder, possibly by a client. The sheer brutality of these murders earmark them as something different, and I think this is why they received so much attention. It was just something totally unknown, even in those days, even in such a low quarter of London.
1 month after the brutal murder of Martha Tabram, a man on his way to work in the early hours of the morning disturbed another murder.
He probably heard their approach and made off through Woods Buildings onto Whitechapel Road, and at that time of the morning, Whitechapel Road would be fairly busy. The killer would be able to mingle with the people and make his way off without being noticed. The beat policeman, P.C. Neal, himself came upon the body and raised the alarm.
This victim was another prostitute, 42-year-old Mary Ann Nichols, known to her friends as Polly. Abandoned by her husband, she had no choice but to take to the streets around Whitechapel to earn her living. and it was here that she died. Shortly after midnight, Polly had been seen leaving the Frying Pan pub. Turned away from her lodging house for lacking the 4 pennies needed for a bed, she drunkenly boasted that she would have no trouble raising the DOS money. "See what a pretty bonnet I have," she said.
That's the tragedy of this. I mean, amongst all the other tragedies, the fact that this must have been the only possible way they could earn a living. I mean, these are people who have touched the bottom. But that must have been part of the attraction for Jack the Ripper, knowing they were the ultimate vulnerable people who wouldn't run away because they needed the shilling.
Polly Nichols was found on her back. Her skirt had been pulled up to above her knees. Yet the doctor called to the scene failed to notice the real brutality of the murder. A long, jagged cut had been made to her stomach. It had caused her intestines to protrude. The killer had also stabbed her genitalia.
The wounds were missed at the scene of the crime because they wore very heavy clothing in those days, and the petticoats, the skirt, had been pulled back down, obviously to cover her modesty, and they just weren't noticed by the doctor. The examination of a murder scene in Victorian days was not the procedure that is carried out today, where every effort is made to keep the whole scene clinically clean and have nobody approach the body but the scenes of crimes officer and the doctor. In those days it was very, very sort of hit and miss. He'd say, yes, she's dead, the body would be moved, the blood would be cleaned away, and then the next examination would be the post-mortem examination at the mortuary.
That didn't stop all the horrific details being reported by the tabloid press.
A rather disreputable publication had these very, very lurid woodcuts illustrating the cuts and the mutilation.
You saw the birth of the tabloid press. The press was the prime mover behind all the sensationalism. They were selling papers, it was a big story, and they pushed it for all it was worth. They immediately linked it with the previous murder on the 7th of August, and then they remembered the April murder, and so without really having a series, we got a series of murders on the 31st of August.
Now we're seeing a build in the violence. If Martha Tabram was a Ripper victim, then he started by stabbing, especially in the abdominal area. With Polly Nichols, he goes to a great rip from the thorax to the abdomen, exposing the intestines.
In a funny way, Polly Nichols lights the touch paper that gets everyone pouring all their paranoia about the East End into the story.
And it seemed this paranoia was well founded. 1 week after the third murder, another Whitechapel prostitute was killed. The body of 40-year-old Annie Chapman was found close to the back door of a lodging house in Hanbury Street.
A body found in open display oftentimes indicates a organized type individual that is so hostile to society that he leaves the body in open display to shock society and to challenge the police and to just create havoc within a community.
Her body was discovered at 10 to 6 by a man called Davis who went into the backyard. He was a resident there. Again, this was a most horrific murder. She had her throat cut, almost severing the head, and she'd been opened up and disemboweled.
This time the doctor looked for the mutilations. He was also able to reveal a definite link between this and the previous murder.
Dr. Baxter Phillips' report, certainly on Annie Chapman, tells us that they were half suffocated to pass out before they were killed, all of them, by having their throats cut so that they died of bleeding from the carotid artery. When it came to the mutilations, he severs the intestines, throws them over her shoulder, and slashes out her uterus, part of her ovaries, part of her bladder.
The people that I have come across who behave in that way have a combination of frustrated sexual need and resentment and anger. But one of the things that stands out so importantly for those people is the control that they have over the person, even briefly, as they die or after they die. And that gives an enormous return for some people, a sexual return, a psychological return.
But this return was not enough for the killer of Annie Chapman.
An odd thing on this occasion was that the murderer actually removed her uterus and took it away with him.
I think that is a most worrying aspect of any murder. The murder itself is dreadful, but I think that as soon as you're into a situation where the killer is taking body parts, not just clothes, not just jewellery, not just... So instead of taking the earrings, he takes the ear. You're looking at trophy taking, and you are looking at someone who is going to keep doing that.
Within 3 weeks, there would be 2 more mutilated bodies for the police to find.
On the 30th of September 1888, we had 2 murders within the space of an hour. The first was the murder of Elizabeth Stride at about 1 a.m. in Dutfield's Yard off Burner Street.
A man, driving his pony and cart into the yard, thought he saw a bundle of rags ahead of him. It was the body of Swedish-born prostitute Elizabeth Stride, known to her friends as Long Liz.
She merely had her throat cut. There was no other mutilation.
Had the killer been distracted before he could carry out his vicious ritual? And if he had, would he be satisfied with his night's work?
Everything means that they are prepared, they are ready to hurt someone tonight. And if they miss that person, then of course they will go on to someone else if they can. It may very well be that things don't go quite the way that they had intended, or they don't get the return, the pleasure that they thought they would get, and so they are still aroused, and another one will be very nice, thank you.
And within the hour there was a further murder. The second victim of the night was another prostitute, Catherine Eddowes.
The beat policeman, P.C. Watkins, turned into the corner of Mitre Square and found the body. And this time the killer really went to work on the victim. She'd had her throat cut, she'd been opened up and disemboweled. This, to my knowledge, is the only known photograph of a victim prior to the post-mortem being carried out. Shows her lying in the shell before the autopsy, where the wound inflicted by the killer is lying open, as is the throat wound as well.
You get the slash, you get the intestines out, part of them cut off, you get some hacking inside the body, in the course of which he removes a kidney as well as her uterus.
The killer had again taken organs, trophies, from his victim. But this time he had added something new to his repartee.
He makes curious marks on her face, 2 V's pointing up on the cheeks, nicks down through the eyelids, and a cut across which takes off the tip of the lobe of her ear.
This wasn't the only difference. This time the murder had taken place in a different part of the East End, within the square mile of the City of London.
The City of London police sits there in its square mile, bang in the middle of the Ripper territory. The City of London police had an extremely ambitious deputy commissioner at the time who wanted to be involved in the Ripper case, but the murders kept happening off his patch. And at last, Catherine Eddowes was killed on his patch, and in no time he was off trying to do detective work on metropolitan territory.
They also brought in the city surveyor, Mr. Foster, to make drawings both of Mitre Square, the body in situ, which recorded everything, including the position of the clothing, the wounds that had been made on the body, and in fact he also did a detailed drawing of the body on the mortuary slab.
Catherine Eddowes' post-mortem was also innovative for the time.
They had a very good police surgeon, Dr. Frederick Gordon Brown, and he was able to say there was no sign, as they put it, of recent connection.
In my experience, I would find that almost, I would say 95% plus of serial homicides are sexually motivated. There are a rare few that are driven and dominated by psychotic hallucinations, delusions, things of that nature. But I think even those have to be looked at carefully. The act of serial and multiple homicide oftentimes is driven by a sexual force. It's very evident that the individual, of course, was pathological in his beginning stages, but each and every homicide would take him further into a mental deterioration.
There had been 6 murders within as many months, but there would be more. And the next would be the bloodiest of all. It had taken the killer only a few minutes to disembowel the 6th victim, Catherine Eddowes. He had also taken her uterus and her left kidney with him when he fled the scene.
The killer was probably aware of the approach of the policeman, probably his hobnail boots making a noise, and made his way off before the policeman arrived.
Leaving the scene, probably covered in blood, the murderer headed back towards Whitechapel, back into the jurisdiction of the Metropolitan Police. As he fled, he dropped a blood-stained rag in the doorway of a tenement block.
It was in the shape of half of Eddowes' apron, which he'd cut off, and wiped his knife, and presumably his hands, and dumped it in the doorway in Goulston Street.
It was covered with blood and feces, or fecal matter. Horrible thing.
For the first time, the police had a solid piece of evidence, but they had no way of using it.
The police didn't really have any forensic science aids at all in those days. In fact, it was so primitive in 1888 that they couldn't classify blood by type or even say it was human. All they could say was that blood was mammalian. It could be the blood of a rabbit, it could be the blood of a human being. So in fact, if you had a suspect under arrest with blood on him, he could claim it was animal blood, and they would not be able to say if it was human blood or not.
But inside the doorway where the killer had dropped the blood-stained rag, there seemed to be a more obvious clue to his identity.
They looked at this writing and jumped to the conclusion that the Ripper had written it. At least some police thought that. The city police particularly wanted to have it photographed and retained. But the Metropolitan Police had seen a lot of very similar things written up, purporting to be by the murderer. I have done 16, 4 more, and I will be finished, things like that. And they thought, no, there's no way he could throw away a piece of apron that he's wiped his hands on as he goes, but he's not going to stop around chalking up nonsense at this point.
The Met got their way. The message was wiped off the wall.
With hindsight, they almost all agreed they probably shouldn't have wiped it off the wall because so much fuss was made about it, not because they thought it was a serious clue. Needn't have anything to do with the murders. We're on the corner of Wentworth Street, where the cheap Jewish shoe market was. My own belief is that somebody had bought something from a Jewish trader that he tried to return, and he's furious. He says the Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing. Suppose it had been seen by traders coming in who said, Jack the Ripper is Jewish, and immediately started a pogrom. They may have done a very sensible thing in getting rid of that.
The police had averted an anti-Jewish riot, but they were no nearer catching their killer.
Most murders are committed by somebody known or related to the person murdered. It's only the tip of the iceberg where you've got these unrelated killings, and they are the most difficult murders to solve, because there's no relationship between the person who's killed and the killer.
6 weeks after the double murder, there was a 7th victim.
After the long pause, you get the final, absolutely dreadful murder of Mary Jane Kelly, the only one of these poor women who had a room of her own to work from. The rest of them all simply gave Fortney knee tremblers standing up against the walls out of doors.
In the early hours of November the 10th, Kelly and her murderer went through the narrow alleyway that led to Miller's Court. They went into the single downstairs room she rented there.
He takes this prostitute into a tiny little room and cuts her to pieces.
She was photographed in situ on the bed as she was left by the killer, and again that would appear to be unique. It's probably our earliest example of a true crime scene photograph.
I found the photographs of that years and years later, and when you see the body the way it was cut from the other side, the other photograph, you realise just what an awesome killing it was.
Mary Kelly is popularly viewed as the ultimate Ripper killing. It's the case where he let his talents run full rein and mutilated the body beyond recognition.
The killer used Kelly's clothes to create a blazing fire. He used its light to carry out the horrific mutilations to her body.
In her room, he's got all the time to do what he likes, and he takes her apart. He effectively cuts her face off, opens her abdominal cavity completely, empties it, leaving organs all over the room.
The uterus had been removed, but was still on the bed. There was no sign of the heart, so it would appear on that occasion the heart was taken away.
Most normal people cannot understand, cannot put themselves in the position of someone who will take a knife or knives and simply rip someone to pieces. It has to be madness. Now, it has to be abnormality, but it doesn't have to be the psychotic madness that we automatically think of. There are other murderers. If you look at Frederick and Rosemary West, look at what they did to the girls that they killed. They brutalized them, they tortured them psychologically, and physically they did things to their bodies that most people simply cannot contemplate. Now, neither of those people are mad in the traditional sense of the word.
It was mid-morning at Miller's Court before the murder was discovered. A man, sent to collect the rent, peered through the broken window and saw what remained of the youngest of the murdered prostitutes.
The question is often asked, why is it prostitutes that are thought to have been the victims of Jack the Ripper? Well, the reason is the one that is still true. They are probably the easiest target group of women of all. Prostitutes lead irregular lives. They come and they go with very few people really knowing where or when.
The police and the press had their bloodiest murder of all. They now also had a name to go with the perpetrator. He had sent them a letter.
It's the famous Dear Boss letter, claiming to be down on whores and he shan't quit until he does get buckled. That he saved some of the proper red stuff in a ginger beer bottle to write with, but it became too thick, like glue, and that he had to use red ink instead. It was published in newspapers on the 4th of October, so the name was actually presented to the general public, as were facsimiles of the letter. I think its importance lies in the fact that it created Jack the Ripper. It created the name.
Jack the Ripper. It's a great title. And in Victorian times, if you couldn't think of what to call somebody, you called them Jack. Jack the Giant Killer, Spring-Heeled Jack, Three-Fingered Jack, Jack Shepherd, Jolly Jack Tar. Jack was the character in popular fiction in Victorian comics. So Jack the Ripper was the great sort of all-purpose name.
You had an ordinary name and this dreadful description, the Ripper. And it seemed to encapsulate, I think, so much of what it was that might have been floating around in people's thoughts and expectations at the time.
But this letter and those that followed it were unlikely to be from the real killer.
you read those letters, they're very, very well thought out. They've been planned and probably practiced before they were finally sent in.
Certainly, there's every reason to believe that the letter dated the 27th of September 1888 was the work of a pressman, boosting the copy, boosting the story for the press.
The letter had been sent to a news agency who sold stories to the new tabloid newspapers.
Now, if you or I wanted to get something in the newspapers, we would probably write to a newspaper. It takes a journalist to know not only that news agencies exist and will distribute it, but to know the address to send it to.
They want Jack the Ripper to have a voice. They want to hear him. They want to know what sort of person this is. And since they couldn't find out, they made it up. They needed a name, and they needed to believe that the murderer was taunting the police.
I'm Jack. I see you are still having no luck catching me.
Nearly 100 years later, there would be a macabre sense of déjà vu with another serial killer who the press had also christened the Ripper.
A uniform copper. I have the greatest respect for you, George, but Lord, you are no nearer catching me now than 4 years ago when I started.
In March 1978, the Yorkshire police received a tape recording and several letters. The sender claimed he was the Yorkshire Ripper, the man who had killed 8 women in the past 4 years.
Now, I remember hearing the tape. I can't remember the exact year. It must have been the mid-1970s, on the Jimmy Young show. And I noticed that there was a turn of phrase in the tape. It was very much from one of the Ripper letters. So I phoned up Bath Police Station and said, I don't know what this means. I don't know if it makes it more likely or less likely that the tape is genuine, but whoever did that tape is a Jack the Ripper buff.
And it wasn't just the historians who'd spotted the link between the original Jack letters and those sent by the so-called Yorkshire Ripper.
Looking at the letters, there were odd turns of phrases, old-fashioned turns of phrases. So we decided that we'd go to the local library, which wasn't computerised then, and get books on the original 1888 Whitechapel murderer. And there was one phrase in particular which stuck out. That thing about leather apron gave me fits, meaning fits of laughter. And in the Yorkshire Ripper letters from Sunderland, or the supposed Yorkshire Ripper letters from Sunderland, the writer said, that photo in the paper gave me fits. And there were many other references to the previous letters.
The bogus tapes, like all the gory details of the Yorkshire Ripper crimes, sold newspapers. The public couldn't wait to hear the details. This bizarre relationship between serial killers, the press and the public was formed back in 1888.
I think the reporting of the Whitechapel murders definitely set the grammar of crime reporting of this kind of crime. The murder site, the interview with the passers-by, the artist's impression of the kind of person who might have done it. It was the first time they'd all come together, and I think the interest in the murders turned it into a mass phenomenon.
The press had created a serial killer. They had given him a name. But by the end of the year, the murders would stop, and Jack the Ripper would disappear. By December 1888, the deaths of 7 prostitutes had been linked to the Whitechapel murderer. But only the last 5 were seriously considered as the work of Jack the Ripper.
But of course, there were other murders after that. In the police files, we have the murder of Alice Mackenzie, Claypipe Alice. This bore more of the signs of the original Ripper killings. She'd had her throat cut and there was abdominal mutilation. although it was not to the degree of the previous victims. Subsequent to that, we move on to what was generally regarded as the final possible Ripper killing, and that was the murder of Francis Coles, which took place on 13th of February 1891. So with that, we had an end of the so-called Whitechapel murders, and no perpetrator was ever caught for any one of them.
But that wasn't for the lack of trying.
I think the investigation wasn't all that bad, even by modern standards. In fact, after the Stride murder, they'd interviewed some 80-odd suspects in detention. So they were certainly very busy. They were following every lead, most of them a waste of time. I think they had fairly open minds, and they would interview anybody and everybody who had any suspicion attached to them.
It gets about that the prostitutes think he was Jewish looking. The man they always refer to as Leather Apron because he's out on the streets in his leather apron. And this builds to a climax when Annie Chapman's body is found, and beside it is found a leather apron. And that had led to near anti-Semitic rioting. People were beating up Jews on the streets, saying no Englishman would do this.
A lot of, I guess, xenophobia would come into it. It was a high immigrant area, and people saw a chance to get other people into trouble with the police.
Suddenly they're identifying other people. You're the person. You're the person. Where were you? You look the part. And a lot of the people who were suspects just looked the part.
He's 28 years old, he's 45 years old, he's 35 years old, he's 5'6", he's 5'8", he's 5'9". He's dark, he's fair, he's got a moustache, he hasn't got a moustache, he's foreign looking, he isn't foreign looking, he's wearing a deerstalker, he's wearing a cloth cap, he isn't wearing a hat at all. If you put together all the eyewitness descriptions, actually they, on the whole, cancel each other out.
Alongside the possibility that the murderer was Jewish came the belief that he was a doctor.
The person who really put the anatomical knowledge idea on the map was Dr. Baxter Phillips. When he examined Chapman, he did say that the killer showed signs of great anatomical knowledge, and that to perform such mutilation in so short of time, he must have had some sort of knowledge.
The dramatised version of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is running at the Lyceum Theatre in the Strand while all this is going on, astonishingly, with an American actor called Mansfield who does this wonderful transformation on the stage. It was done with lights, turns in from Dr. Jekyll into Mr. Hyde. Evil doctor, the beast in man, breaking out from this professional, respectable exterior, the doctor.
I think that probably had a bearing on public attitude and opinion. Although a lot of people in those days did have such knowledge, even slaughterers would have a basic knowledge of anatomy that they could relate to the human body.
But slaughterman or doctor, if the murderer was to pass unnoticed through the streets of Whitechapel, one thing is for certain: he would not have looked like the Jack the Ripper of popular culture.
The popular image of the Ripper emerged from popular literature and drawings to illustrate lurid stories of the crimes. The classic image, of course, is the Gladstone bag, the top hat, the cloak, and a lot of fog swirling about. Well, in fact, on the nights of all the murders, it was not foggy. The Gladstone bag was described at the time as being carried by suspects, so the shiny black bag we can date to 1888. The most common form of wear would seem to be a long overcoat in the descriptions given by the witnesses. I think the top hat is a much later addition.
What the murderer does have to have is some expectation of getting away. He probably was unexceptional in appearance in many ways, because people who are striking in their appearance tend to stand out. And if you have a person who stands out and you have the local community now agitated and looking, then he's likely to be seen if he's there more than once. Unless, of course, you expect to see him there anyway.
The police had come to the same conclusion, and they thought they knew a fair bit about who Jack the Ripper was.
The police at the time thought he was local. He was going to be somebody whom the prostitutes would accept as a client. Now, this really rules out toffs. These very, very poor women who just leant up against walls would expect to be servicing very, very poor local men, not splendid top-hatted figures coming down from the West End.
The police had 3 possible local men in the frame.
The possible suspects were in fact named by Sir Melville Macnaghten in his so-called memoranda of February 1894.
The first was Montague Druitt.
Druitt was actually found floating in the Thames at the end of December 1888, so he had a suicide that fitted in nicely with the cessation of the so-called Ripper murders.
There was even less evidence against the second suspect, Michael Ostrog, a Russian Jew who was well known as a confidence trickster and thief. He was also known for carrying a Gladstone bag.
Certainly Ostrog, I think we can totally clear from the frame. He was in custody the following year, he went into an asylum, and he was never investigated seriously as the Ripper. The big mystery is the third one, Kosminski, who, according to Macnaghten, was a poor Polish Jew. He was incarcerated, we're told, as an imbecile.
The first thing you'd expect you have to do is to check all the asylum records across London and see, well, who could this be? As of this date, I'm still the only person who has ever checked all the asylum records. And there's actually only one person who fits. And this is man, David Cohen, who goes in exactly as the murders end, taken in by the police because he is a raving maniac.
But in 1995, another contemporary police suspect came to light. An American quack doctor called Francis Tumblety.
The American doctor theory is very interesting. Obviously, I suppose I would say that. I wrote the book in 1995 when his name first came to light. He was named by Chief Inspector Littlechild, who was head of the Special Branch at Scotland Yard in 1888, as a very likely suspect. In the early hours of the morning of the double murder, a landlady was woken up by her lodger returning to his rooms. And in the morning, she stated he left a shirt for washing which was covered in blood. She communicated with the police her suspicions about her lodger, and he fled the same day before the police got there. And it later emerged that in all probability her lodger was an American. He was pursued to New York in December 1888 by Inspector Andrews of Scotland Yard. This we know for a fact. What I don't think they had was hard evidence. At the end of the day, I have to say the case against Tumblety is not proven. He's certainly a good contemporary suspect. We haven't proved he's the Ripper.
It's partly a whodunit with the last chapter missing, which is incredibly intriguing. So it leaves the way open for people to have a crack at solving the mystery, to be armchair sleuths, which we all enjoy.
And a lot of people have tried. In all, more than 200 books have been written on the subject.
The first full-length book in this country on the Ripper was in 1928. It was The Mystery of Jack the Ripper by Leonard Matters, and he came up with the Dr. Stanley theory, that it was a doctor avenging the death of his son by syphilis at the hands of a prostitute, going round murdering these women until he found the one responsible.
One popular theory was that the Ripper murders were carried out by Freemasons within the government, covering up an unacceptable royal marriage.
The royal conspiracy really saw its origins with an article by Dr. Thomas Stowell in The Criminologist in 1970. You had the BBC mini-series done, which they propounded this Masonic conspiracy involving the royal family, whereby the Duke of Clarence was tied up because he'd married a Catholic.
The theory went that the prostitutes were killed and mutilated using a Masonic ritual because they had witnessed the marriage.
Stephen Knight wrote a best-selling book on it. And in fact, several films were based subsequently on it, such as Murder by Decree. You had the Michael Caine film in 1988. And in fact, now they're making From Hell, which again, I think we're going to see a similar theory emerging.
In fact, Jack the Ripper has been appearing in films for years.
You've got someone stalking a hapless victim at night. You've got the knife, you've got the light, you've got the alleyways. I mean, the iconography, even in Psycho, which is set in a 1950s motel, the iconography of Jack the Ripper becomes paramount.
In reality, without any real surviving clues to the identity of Jack the Ripper, the modern criminologists have turned to the science of offender profiling for an answer.
Profiling was developed, as we understand it today, by law enforcement, i.e. the FBI. We involved mental health professionals as consultants to us to help us better understand the criminal mind, to help us better understand personality disorders, sexual disorders, psychotic disorders, that type of thing.
When a crime is committed, people, offenders, leave traces of who they are and how they've done what they've done at the scene of the crime.
What is done to that victim, what the victim has to endure from the killer. Is there sex before, during, or after death? How the victim is positioned, sequence of events, all this becomes signature. And it is driven by the emotions of the individual that once the victim is obtained, they now have to act out saying things in a certain manner to attain some fulfillment.
It's also tragically the case that the more killings, the more offences you have in a series, the better the information you should be able to derive from it to move your investigation forward. But the problem with the Ripper case is there is the outline of information. The information is given in verbal terms very often, in a manner that was suitable for evidence of the day.
So what can profilers tell us about the Whitechapel murderer?
We didn't believe by any stretch of the imagination he was a surgeon or a counselor or anything of that nature. We believe that he came from a lower socioeconomic income.
There was probably a man who had some local knowledge of the area in which he worked, who had considerable vigour. You're not looking at a person who was handicapped or aged or infirm.
He was single, never been married. We believe that he was fearful of women and was killing and mutilating them so he could de-sex them, if you will.
But some of the killings suggest an even stronger motive.
We believe that he had an intense hatred for women because of the removal of the sexual parts of the body, or at least the displacements of those parts.
The more extreme mutilations on at least one victim could mean the police made a mistake, and that not all the murders were committed by the same hand.
When investigators are faced with another crime, if they are already enmeshed in the investigation of what seems to be a series of crimes, then the slightest similarity with the one that comes next makes it very easy to add it into the series, so that in a sense people are expecting there to be another victim, and here she is.
Certainly, at the time of the Kelly murder, the police suspected it might be a domestic killing made to look like the work of the Ripper, a so-called copycat crime.
Copycat murders have occurred. I've worked on several where people have covered up their murder by linking it to a series of other homicides. You know, say 3, 4 have gone down and they'll kill either accidentally or intentionally, and then from the news media make it look like those other homicides. That's hard to do if, in fact, you have good people assessing them, because they'll see this, they'll spot the difference. If the police are less sophisticated, they might buy into the idea.
If you look at the murder of the last victim, Kelly, it is easy to see how people see it as the culmination of an escalating pathway of killings. It doesn't need to have been the culmination. I saw the body of a young woman who, when I saw her, the way she was left reminded me immediately of that poor woman Kelly. What I saw in front of me was very similar, except perhaps for the amount of blood. And what I know is that the man who killed the victim I looked at probably hadn't killed anyone before. He had worked through a series of sexual offences, of rapes and sexual assaults to get to where he got to, but he hadn't, so far as we know, killed anyone else.
Mary Kelly may not be the only Ripper victim murdered by another hand. There are doubts surrounding the death of Long Liz Stride as well.
She'd been murdered merely by her throat being cut, and the injuries were actually dissimilar to the injuries inflicted on Chapman, whose head was nearly severed. Possibly the murderer wasn't disturbed. In my opinion, it bears all the hallmarks of a domestic killing. I think that the person who murdered Stride knew her, and I do not think it was the killer who's become known as Jack the Ripper.
The Jack the Ripper of legend and common myth may not have existed. But there was a serial killer at work in Whitechapel in 1888.
If we look at the 5 so-called Ripper murders, then I think we can say that with certainty that only 3 were committed by the same hand. Certainly the first one was Nichols, the second Chapman, and the third Eddowes. And in each of those cases I think the wound was the target. And the modus operandi with those 3 is so close that I think we have to accept the killer was the same person.
The man who killed these 3 women, and the killers of the other 8 prostitutes on police files, were never caught.
To secure a conviction, they would have needed a confession, they would have needed a witness who saw the murder committed, or they would have needed a policeman catching the murderer committing the crime. They had none of that. They couldn't prove it in 1888. We will not prove it today.
All I can do at this point is leave you with a rhyme popular in this area for many years after the murders. It deals with identity and it goes like this. I'm not a butcher, I'm not a yid, nor yet a foreign skipper. I'm just your own light-hearted friend. Yours truly, Jack the Ripper. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much.
So while we are all left wondering if Jack the Ripper was simply a myth, the psychologists are turning to other such myths to discover the real origins of the serial killer.
Serial killing didn't suddenly spring fully formed into existence in the late 1880s. Before we had serial killers beginning to be recognised in that way, we tended to attribute the victims to other things. You will hear of vampires, you'll hear of ghouls, you'll hear of werewolves, you'll hear of all sorts of strange and mysterious things. Many of the people whose deaths are attributed to these mythological characters are really plain, straightforward victims of serial killers. We just didn't understand them in that way then.
And was it just coincidence that Britain's next serial killer would claim to have drunk the blood of his victims?